Well, this is Dave Gaddis, and today, this is May 20th, 2016. We're interviewing Gary Sieb, who's a Director of Planning in the town of Coppell. So, welcome, Barry. Let's start at the very beginning, and why don't you tell us when and where you were born?
Okay. Oh, man, you are the same questions, I guess. Well, thanks, David, for coming in and interviewing me. I was actually born in 1940 in Lansing, Michigan. So I'm basically, I guess, a transplanted Yankee who's been in Texas for probably a little over 40 years.
Okay. So what were your parents doing that you were in Michigan?
My mother was a stay-at-home mom. My father owned a business that was involved with mechanical equipment. John Deere and Caterpillar tractors were some of his big clients.
Okay. Did you stay there your entire childhood, or did you move around?
Yeah, I was in Lansing until I was 18 years old. Then I went into the military. Okay. So I went through high school there, went into the military.
What did you do in the military?
I was with the 82nd Airborne Division and 7th Special Forces Group.
Okay. This would have been late 50s, early 60s?
Yeah, 58 through 60, 61.
Okay. Did you go overseas, or were you?
No, I was primarily stationed, well, we did some work outside the country when I was with the Special Forces Group, but for the most part, I was stationed at Fort Bragg, North Carolina.
Okay. And then you went back to school, or?
Yeah.
Okay.
After my military obligation, I went back to school in Michigan. And as a matter of fact, when I got out of high school, I had been accepted into the architectural program at the University of Michigan. But when I came back, I guess I was, and I'd always wanted to be an architect or be in the design profession. So when I came back out of the military, maybe a little bit more mature than I was when I entered the military, I figured out that if I wanted to be involved in cities and what's going on with urban development, urban form, I could probably have more influence if I was a planner as opposed to being an architect. So I decided to sort of change my direction for what I wanted to do, and I entered the urban planning program at Michigan State, which at the time was one of 5 or 6 programs in the country that offered a master's degree in urban planning.
And so how did you know about urban planning before you went in?
Well, when I was a kid, my parents always went to Florida in the winters. And in those days, this was before we had the interstate highway system. So we had to go through Ohio, Tennessee, North Carolina to get to Florida. And going through those different communities, I was like in the 6th grade, 7th grade, 8th grade, I was sort of enthralled by the different kinds of cities and small towns we went through. Lansing had a population of about 120, 130,000. That was the home of Oldsmobile at that time. So it was really more of a kind of a manufacturing city. But you'd go through these small towns, basically in the mountains, and I was just amazed at the way they were different from what I was exposed to as I grew up. And then getting into Florida, Miami, Lauderdale, Tampa, it just basically piqued my interest, even though, as I mentioned earlier, I've always been interested in urban form and what's going on in the development of communities, I guess.
Do you remember any of the professors at Michigan State?
Oh, yeah. Carl Goldschmidt, who was very active in the program. Who else was there? Stanley Farmas, Dean Glick. Those are probably, and Joe Prochaska. Joe Prochaska was more of my mentor than anybody, I guess. But I have fond memories of that program, and the instruction I got.
Any classmates?
Not too many classmates left in my in my program. When I first got out of graduate school, I corresponded with 2 or 3 of my compadres at Michigan State. They were still planning in small towns in Michigan. But after graduate school and I came to Texas, I sort of lost contact with those fellows.
And I think you started working while you were an undergraduate?
Yeah. I was fortunate to get, so it wasn't really an internship, but in effect it was an internship working for the East Lansing Planning Department. And of course Michigan State is located in East Lansing. So did primarily analytical work while I was there.
Such as?
Housing analysis. Back in those days, urban renewal was kind of the thing to do. And even though East Lansing wasn't that big, they had one area of the city that was an urban renewal area. And my responsibility was to do a lot of the analytical work. You know, basically look at the housing, try to determine whether it was sound, deteriorated, dilapidated, those sorts of things, give that data to the planning director, and then he took it on to the commission and council.
And I always like to ask this for the new students. You make maps, and how did you make those maps?
Oh, back in those days, man. In fact, even when I was in Dallas, I'll have a story about Dallas when we get to that point of the interview. Yeah, everything was done by hand. Prismacolors, all of the good old stuff that we don't even know about anymore. Very graphic, very colorful, but very labor intensive to put together.
Very expensive to reproduce, too.
Absolutely, yeah.
You actually had to go to a printer.
That's right,
so,
yeah.
So you finished your degree in
19, yeah, no, really the middle 60s.
Okay.
And my first job out of undergraduate school was in Charlotte, North Carolina,
okay,
where I was basically a staff planner. We were doing a sort of pseudo new town development up by Lake Norman, which is north of Charlotte. My director there was Bill McIntyre, who actually had gone to the University of Michigan. I was a Michigan Stater, so we had some friendly rivalries, but he was a great guy. When I was in Charlotte, I again got involved in the urban renewal process. Did urban renewal studies off of the sort of the southeast quadrant of the city, basically doing the same thing I did at Michigan State, only much more intensive. It wasn't a part-time job. It was for at least 40 hours a week, basically doing the physical analysis part of urban renewal, as well as this kind of this pseudo new town up by Lake Norman, as I mentioned, just north of Charlotte. Let's see, I was there for 2 years. Between my first and second year, graduate students from the University of North Carolina came down to just observe what goes on in a governmental city planning agency. And that's where I guess, well, there were a couple of reasons why I went to North Carolina, but one of the reasons was I was very impressed with the students that came down. The kinds of questions they asked, and the fact that you couldn't just answer the question, that was the end of it. It was always why, or why did you do that, or expand on that, that sort of thing, which in my mind said, you know, these people are really pretty good thinkers. Stu Chapin was actually teaching at Carolina, Maynard Huffschmidt. And I guess what really prompted me to go to graduate school was the fact that during my second year in Charlotte, it was a Charlotte-Mecklenburg Regional Planning Commission, so it was a city-county agency. A new planner came in who had a master's from Pratt Institute, Michael Schneiderman. Michael was a great guy, funny guy. But there was an opening in the department for kind of like a senior planner position. We were both basically, you know, planners at that lowest level. And we both interviewed for the job, and Michael got it. And I thought, you know, number one, I've been here a little bit longer than he has. Number two, you know, I think I'm doing a great job. Bill McIntyre said I would take another planner from Michigan State, but somehow he got this position. So I went to Bill and I said, you know, just be real honest with me. I've been here longer, you know, the kind of work I do, I guess is good because you've praised me. Why did Mike get the job over me? And he said, Gary, said he has a master's degree. And I said, well, Bill, when I went to Michigan State, you know, it was a 4-year program in planning, and my instructors there said, a master's degree in planning is a 2-year program. You've been through a 4-year program. You don't need a master's. And Bill said, Gary, and I'll never forget this, Bill said, it never hurts to get as much education as you can. It may not help you, but it certainly won't hurt. And that's when I said, I got to go back to graduate school.
And so you did.
And so I did. Went to University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill.
Okay.
That was 68, no, that was, yeah, 68 to 70. It was a 2-year program at that time, 55 credit hours, and you had to have an internship. Fortunately, because I had that background in planning, I was offered the internship at Chapel Hill. Everybody in the program wanted to stay in Chapel Hill. You know, it's the southern part of heaven is what we call Chapel Hill, North Carolina. And I was competing against all of these northeastern educated people, Tufts and Harvard and Yale and Princeton and all those places. But because I had that experience in Charlotte, I think that's the reason I got the job in Chapel Hill. And I was basically more of a caretaker there between the first and second year. They had a planning director who was after his PhD. So I would work and basically take the telephone calls and talk about zoning and kind of explain what a master plan, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera it is. And then went on into my second year. This was in 1969-70. At that time in the profession, you could go anywhere in the world you wanted to go in planning. In fact, I remember there used to be a commercial for Camel cigarettes. And they would have this big ad on the back of Life or Look magazine, big colorful ad, of course with a cigarette pack, and it would say something to effect what turns you on. It wasn't turn on at that time, but that's basically what the message was. And then they'd have this picture of a guy who was a city planner. So I thought, man, I am it. I am on my way. And luckily, I had an opportunity to go basically wherever I wanted, from Washington to Hawaii to back to Michigan, Florida, Georgia, and Texas. I'd never been to Texas. I'd seen the movie Giant, because I'm a big movie fan, and I thought, you know, that might be a place I'd like to work. So luckily, in those days, the organizations would fly you here and put you up in a hotel, da-da-da-da. So I came to Dallas, and I was absolutely amazed at the fact that it wasn't like Giant. It wasn't desert all over, you know, it was a beautiful, beautiful city. Talked to the planning director, a guy named Jim Schroeder, and he explained to me what they do here and where I would come into the organization. And at that time, Dallas had a series of jobs that started like 12, 14, 15, 17, assistant director. And he said, I can bring you in at a level 17. And he said, but I want to tell you, we're in the throes of reorganizing the department. We're getting ready to do a community renewal program grant. He said, I think if you came here, there would be a lot of opportunity to advance in the program. So I went back to Chapel Hill. I talked to my wife. She wanted to go to Hawaii. I said, yeah, we ought to try this. So we came to Dallas, and I guess the rest is history, because I've been in Dallas or surroundings basically the rest of my career, although I have done a couple of consulting jobs.
before we get away from North Carolina, you want to talk about some of the people in the program there? You mentioned Stu Chapin.
Oh yeah, Stu Chapin, Maynard Huffschmidt, a guy named Mike Stedman, who was really a great housing guy. In fact, he ended up in the HUD office in Washington, D.C. I guess I remember most my compadres. Lane Kendig, who is a consultant now, wrote impact zoning. I've got it here somewhere. Performance zoning.
Yeah.
Performance zoning.
Matter of fact, he's talking about updating that.
Yeah.
So.
Yep. I know. He and I had kind of a healthy relationship because he went to Michigan and I went to Michigan State, and we took the same classes with Stedman. There was a guy named Marvin Rose who I really enjoyed while we were there. We used to play tennis together and everything. But as I was saying earlier, after you get out into the field and you're concentrating on what you're doing, and I'm in Texas, and most of the planners that go to North Carolina stay on the East Coast. In fact, Jack Parker, who was the director of the program, told me, he said, I told him I want to come to Texas. He said, well, be very careful about that, because he says most of our people end up in the federal government. And if you go to Texas, that's going to limit your ability to get back up here. Well, wasn't really interested in the federal government. In fact, I had a job offer with HUD down in Atlanta at the same time as considering this job, and I went down there and I asked them questions about, well, where are your analytical people? Well, they're 2 stories up, or two floors up. And where are your people that are involved in design and urban form? Well, they're 2 stories down. And I thought, I don't want to get into that. So I felt that this was the best place for me to go, even though Jack Parker said, be careful where you go. Shirley Weiss was another one of my instructors. As I said, Mike Brooks, who's been active in the program. It was just a really great educational experience for me.
Did you do a thesis?
No, I did the 2 extra classes.
Okay.
Yep.
So you took the job in Dallas.
Mm-hmm.
What did you start out doing?
I was, basically when I came into the program, I was involved in kind of urban rehab, and we were trying to develop an interim comprehensive plan because the city of Dallas hadn't had a comprehensive plan for years and years and years. And earlier we talked about the way we did graphics in the early days. When I came to Dallas, we decided to divide the city into 64 sort of sub-neighborhoods. And we'd go into those neighborhoods for the citizen participation part. And we had to have graphics because that's the way people understand how planning is done. And we did something called Zipatone, which was, you talk about labor intensive. We had our whole graphic section work on these Zipatone overlays so that we went in there with that overhead projector. We could explain, this is what the land use is, this is what the zoning is, this is how we think this might move forward. And we did that for these 64 neighborhoods. Some of it was positive. Some of our planning work was criticized, which of course we get. But in those days, I was pretty young into this field. I'd only been here I'd only been in the program 4 or 5 years. And you take that personal. But you eventually get over that. The other part of my responsibility was helping to administer the Community Renewal Program, the CRP grants. We hired 150 people to be involved in that program where they went out in the community and did all kind of analytical work. In fact, one of the people that was hired in that program became the city manager in Coppell, Jane Hart, in Dallas, I'm sorry. Jan Hart. The program itself was about 3 years, and at the end of that program, urban renewal in Dallas, Texas wasn't the most sort of acceptable sort of planning work, so that program just kind of floated away. In about 1974, 75, when we moved into the new City Hall, the IMP designed City Hall, which in my mind is still one of the greatest buildings in downtown Dallas, the city planning director came to me, Jim Schroeder, one day and said, Gary, he said, the city council wants you to start making the public presentations before the council. And I said, okay, you know, what do I need to do? And he said, you need to figure that out. I think one of the reasons they had me make the public presentations was because early on when we were going through this ARP program, it was my responsibility to go all over the country and recruit people to Dallas. I went to Berkeley, I went to Washington, D.C., Chicago, to bring who we felt would be really good people into the program. And maybe that's where they decided I need to be sort of the public spokesman for the planning department. So Jim, I don't know if he's upset or not, because he also said, did you ever talk to the city council about this? And I said, no, Jim, all I know is, you know, I work for you. He said, well, you're going to need to make the presentation. So I went in and I did the presentations, and I kind of enjoyed that. I love public speaking anyway. And after the first meeting, Jim called me back into his office, and he said, you know, he said, they really liked what you did. Who told you how to do it that way? And I said, well, Jim, you know, I talked to you and you said, do it. So I did it. And so the rest is history, David. That was the end of that deal. And I did the public presentations before council relative to zoning cases for the next 8 or 9 years. Well, because I was doing the presentations, I had to know something about the zoning section. So I got transferred from sort of the administrative part of planning into the zoning section. I was promoted to assistant director. I think I was maybe 31 years old at that time. And I've been told I was the youngest planning director, assistant planning director in the city. I don't know if that's true or not, but anyway, I was. So I became the assistant director in charge of about 45 people. In Dallas, we had public hearings.
Was Jim still the planning
Yes,
director?
yeah, Jim.
You remember who was the city manager or mayor?
Oh yeah. Well, when I first came to Dallas, Eric Johnson was the mayor, and Mr. McDonald was the city manager. George Schrader was the assistant city manager. Jim Favor was an assistant city manager. Shortly thereafter, Mr. McDonald retired. Eric Johnson's term ended. George Schrader was appointed as the new city manager. And I'm trying to think the mayors I worked with, Wes Wise, Annette Strauss, Bobby Folsom, goes on and on and on and on. So that was sort of the elected part of the organization that I made my presentations.
And how about some of your colleagues in the planning department?
How about them?
Some of their names, people you remember?
Yeah, John Kimbrough, of course, he was my right-hand man. Fred Tim was my zoning administrator. Was my subdivision administrator. Mike Finley was involved in the department for a long, long time. Marvin Kraut was in the department. In fact, Rob McCaffrey was in the planning department. Rob McCaffrey was a guy I hired fresh out of an A&M back in 1970-71, I guess. And I think Janet, his wife, was in part of that that program where we were doing the CRP deal. Anyway, they got married, and the rest there is history, and I saw his interview. Who else was in the department, in the planning department that I can think of right now? Well, Marcy, of course, came in. A gal named, well, she wasn't in our department, but Peterman, who was in the building inspection department, now is a consultant in Fort Worth, I guess, was involved in that. Kathy Stivers, who eventually married Willie Cothram, who was a city council member there, and now he is the president of Master Plan, they do a lot of planning work in a lot of cities. Those are some of the people that I was involved with in the department itself.
Well, I kind of sidetracked you. You were talking about you'd just been promoted to the assistant
right,
director?
Assistant director. in Dallas, we had zoning cases every week, and that's why I had a staff of 45 people. And every week I had 3 zoning planners that presented the case before the Planning Commission, and then I always made the presentation at City Council, typically bringing one of them with me in case there was a question that I couldn't answer. So basically I became what they call the zoning czar in the city of Dallas in the years when it was blowing and going. 17, 18 cases a week, doing all the graphics. When we moved into the new city hall, of course, we had a completely different system where we had to do the presentations on the big screens, the great big screens, if you've ever been to Dallas City Hall. It's a great, great venue. And then I'm sitting down there, or standing down there making the presentation, and the council's asking the tough questions, and I'm dealing with the Lewis Nichols of the worlds, and the Joe Garys of the worlds, and all of those guys that are gone now.
Any particular case particularly stand out to you?
No, well,
significant?
there were a lot of controversial cases in Dallas, Texas. A lot in North Dallas dealing with density. In fact, when we get into Coppell, we'll talk about that all over again. I mean, I've seen it, and I've seen it, and I've seen it. 10, 20, 30 years worth. It's always density. And, you know, once I'm in, shut the door and don't let anybody else in the organization, into the community. It was a fun time. It's sort of like planning work. It's fun. Sometimes it gets a little disappointing, but you have to forget about that and move on. Fortunately for me, in '83, when they went to single-member districts, it was time for me to do something else, and I went on into the dark side. I went into the development side.
Well, talk about that.
Well, it's kind of interesting. I had interviewed for the director's job when Jack Shoup got it. And at that time, I was told, you know, Sieb, you're pretty young, you're 35 years old, you need to get a little bit more mellowing, and then you'll be ready for the director's job. And so Jack was here probably 4 or 5 years, and it opened up again, and I applied again. And I didn't get it again, and this time Dennis Wilson got the job. And so a local developer who had kind of followed my career after that announcement was made called me and said, I think it's time for you to do something else. And he said, plus with single member districts, you know what happens there, you know, it's like sort of the Chicago model. How would you like to join my organization? And I thought, you know, having not been a consultant, hadn't been a developer, yeah, I'd like to try that. So Jim Williams set me up with my own company, Cornerstone Development, and we did the Caruth Home Place, which is the single-family stuff at basically Northwest Highway and Central Expressway, the southwest quadrant, behind all of the tall buildings there today. And he called me his land man. I was the guy that had to figure out how, once we bought properties, how to develop them. Jim was, I'm not going to say he was a taskmaster, but you needed to do your job. In fact, Rob McCaffrey worked with him for a while too. And so we bought some property on Straight Lane, and I was responsible for having that property rezoned from 1 unit to 3 units on a piece of property. And on Straight Lane, I don't know if you know people who live there, Ross Perot lived there. There were a lot of movers and shakers that were involved in anything that happened within their community, but in this particular case, maybe because of the way we did the plan, it was supported by people. So that's one program I was involved in. The Caruth Home Place, I had an architect who worked for me, who designed the units. Back in those days, you know, it was, if you had a $500,000 house, it would be like $1.2 million today, I guess. One of the I guess one of the bad moves we made in that development was I thought it would be nice to have like a babbling brook behind some of these houses that would give a more of a pastoral setting. And so we built this little meandering pond behind probably 8 of the units, and of course used that as an amenity to sell these houses for $900,000, $1 million, $1 million too. They sold fine. The problem was maintaining that was an absolute nightmare. We had to hire one guy that retained that, made sure it was clean every day, because the people who buy in those communities demand that sort of thing. So that was kind of a downside. Well, I worked for Jim for like 2.5 years, and then 1985, 86 came when the market absolutely plunged. And we basically just broke up camp, and that was it. I was out of job for maybe a week when Nathan Meyer, who was an engineer for the city of Dallas, whom I knew when I was with Dallas, called me and said, "Man," he said, "I need you to come, I need a planner." So I went to Nathan Myers. I was his executive vice president of planning for another 2 years. The market didn't really change that much, and after 2.5 years, I was basically without a job. About that time, a consulting job opened up in Nashville, Tennessee, to work for the Nashville-Davidson County Metropolitan Planning Commission. I applied and I got the job, and it was to look at the zoning ordinance and come up with some new innovative techniques with zoning. It was a 1-year contract. Nashville-Davidson County has a board of 44 or 45 commissioners. And if I thought it was tough to get work done through Dallas with 14 people, Nashville was not easy. In fact, at that time, Oprah Winfrey's father was on the commission. Just, one of those. So I did that work for a year. My contract is over at the end of the year. My wife, who happens to be a Dallas native, said, "We need to go back to Dallas." I said, "Geez," I said, "I love Nashville. I know I can get a job with a consulting firm here." She said, "We're going back to Dallas." So we came back to Dallas. I applied for this job and got it, and I've been here since 1989.
Well, Coppell's changed a lot in that period of time. What kinds of changes have occurred?
Yeah, when I came here, none of this development was out here at all. This building wasn't here. Population was 16,000. We had about 3 elementary schools. The city is actually landlocked. It's basically 14.5 square miles, so we can't expand at all. A lot of open space. It was a job that was challenging to me because I could see, being so close to the Metroplex, next door to the DFW airport, 5 minutes to the airport itself, that something was going to happen here. I thought I'd be in Coppell for 2 years and then move on. So I came here. I bought my first house here. It's 2016 and I'm still here, so there must be something about the community that I liked.
And the population today is?
Roughly 40,000.
Okay.
Yeah.
And more than 3 elementary schools?
Oh yeah, we've got 7 now. In fact, from 1980 to 1990, Coppell was the 3rd fastest growing small city in the nation, which is defined as 50,000 or less. So there was a lot going on. I was the first planning director in this community. In fact, when I first came here, I was in charge of planning, engineering, building inspection, the library, of all things. And I said to the city manager, "Why the library?" And he said, "Because I have to have someone that knows something about municipal government, how you deal with city councils, and you're it." Well, thankfully, that ended. We brought in a new engineering director, Ken Griffin. We hired a library director, And through some reorganization, we put building inspection with engineering, and so now planning is my big deal, which I smile about.
So, Coppell has kind of an image of being a little bit more upscale, higher design standards. Are there any particular things that you're particularly?
Oh, yeah. Money Magazine said we were the third most enjoyable place to live in the nation as far as small cities go. We're the 8th best city for kids to live. We're primarily a single-family community. I have 3,000 apartments in the city. There's no more land zone for apartment development. Roughly 14,000 single-family houses. A very professional city, very well-educated group, which can sometimes be somewhat of a problem. We are diversifying. 5 years ago, our Asian population was about 4%. Today it's 17%. That leads to challenges itself. Speaking of India and figuring out foreigners are a couple of books that I'm wading through so that I can understand what our Indian Mideastern population needs from us as planners. As far as stuff I'm proud of, go down Denton Tap Road. Look at the architectural style of our buildings here. Look at the landscaping. 30% of any development in Coppell has to be landscaping. Everything has to go through site plan review. In fact, kind of an interesting story on that. Back in 1991 or 2, we had a group called, it was a park and fly parking facility that wanted to locate in Coppell because it was so close to the airport. So they came to town and we worked through all of the requirements. We have an 80% masonry guideline, which does not include stucco. So your building has to be brick and stone. They came in, they were approved, started building the building, and about 9 or 10 months later, I get a call from the chairman of the Planning Commission saying, have you looked at the Park and Fly facility out on Royal Lane? I said, no. She said, you better go look at it because it's not what we approved. So I went out and looked at it, and it was white brick, and we do not allow white brick in Coppell. The building's about 90% complete. So I'm thinking, oh boy, what are we going to do? So I go to council and I tell them, hey, da-da-da-da, we screwed up, didn't do it right. Council said, okay, don't let it happen again. So that's what precipitated our demand and our requirement of every development that comes into Coppell has to go through site plan review with the exception of single-family residential properties. And that's really been a much benefit to the community because by going through the site plan review process, the council knows exactly what they're getting. We have color boards that are required for each development, and the color board can't be a photograph. It's got to be the actual material that the building's going to be constructed of. So they get that touchy-feely deal. Sometimes the color boards weigh about 60 pounds, so we have to tell them, slice the brick, slice the stone, put it on a board, let us see what the color itself is. So I'm pretty proud of the fact that we have a lot of development code requirements that I guess are tougher than a lot of places. Signage is a very, very difficult approval to get in Coppell, and I guess that goes back to when I was in Dallas. Wei Ming Liu, I think Robin mentioned Wei Ming too. Wei Ming is a North Carolina graduate. In fact, I recruited him to come to Coppell. I come to Dallas. And I was involved with Wei Ming when we did the sign ordinance in Dallas. Very controversial. We didn't get a whole lot done, but it put in my mind, be careful with signage wherever you go. And so we have tough signs, landscaping, building materials. Basically, the city is 95% developed. A very strong demarcation between the residential stuff, which is on the east side of the city, and the warehouse commercial development on the west side, which is under the flight path of DFW Airport. Overall, it's been a really, really good positive sort of challenge for me. And staying here 2 years is now 27. So there's something to be said.
And speaking of the flight path, my impression is that Coppell has done a much better job of preventing the encroachment issues that Grapevine and Irving have suffered because of.
Absolutely, absolutely. In fact, when I first came here, we did a noise study about where's the 65 LDN line and where's it going to be 3 years from now. Early on, they had the Stage 2 aircraft, and they were very, very loud. And our 65 LDN line was way outside of where it is today. So consequently, what's happened with Stage 3 aircraft and the technology in the aircraft industry that they're quieter and quieter and quieter, we've been able to allow some more development on the west side of, I'm going to say, Denton Tap, that really wasn't allowed when I first came here, because at 65, that's the noise code thing, keeps moving to the west, which allows us the opportunity to put more residential structures in the city, and that's what the community wants. Right now, a single-family house in Coppell is roughly maybe 500,000, 657, several $1 million houses. When I came here in 1989, there was one house that was $1 million house, and that was Don Carter's house, the guy who owned the Mavericks.
So let's go back some time and talk about professional organizations.
Sure.
And, talk about AIP, American Institute of Planners. When did you first join them? And how
It's all right behind you up there. When I first came to Dallas in 1969, the organization was, I'm not going to say floundering, but there wasn't a whole lot of activity. And from 69 to 71 to 72, I was very active in the organization. I was chapter president, I was chapter secretary. I worked very closely with a guy named Wayne Snyder that I think I mentioned before, Doug Creer, Pat Lewis, Al Marsden, people who were planners who kind of needed some direction, I guess, on what do we do with this organization.
Were you also a member of ASPO as well?
Oh yes, yeah, absolutely. In fact, it's kind of a joke, but I was the first person in Texas, in the Dallas area, to get AICP. Okay. And a lot of people have made that claim, but I can tell you the reason I was the first one is because I was the first one. That in those days we did an oral interview. My interviewers were Marvin Springer, Bill Shevlin, and one guy out of Arkansas. And the reason I know I'm the first one is because I was the first interview and I passed the AICP. In fact, I have a letter back there from Tom Roberts congratulating me for being a charter member of the AICP.
Okay. And you said you were active in the North Central section here. Oh, I guess the third organization that was active at the time was CPAT, the City
Yes.
Association.
Yep.
Were you active
Yep.
in that?
I was active. In fact, I've got a thing back there, certificate of membership of CPAT back in 1970 or 71.
In fact, a lot of people don't realize that back in the 60s, CPAT was actually more active than AIP.
You're absolutely right, and and that we actually had a lobbying group that went down to Austin and actually lobbied for. In fact, I think Craig Farmer was very much involved in that. I think he still is today, but that was back in the old days, sure.
Okay. And so after you were active in the North Central section, did you do anything else in the organization, or?
No, what happened was, I became the assistant director in Dallas. That was a very challenging job. I'm the guy that had to make the presentation before council. So I basically passed the baton to the younger, the newer people, and it keeps getting passed on and on.
Okay. Well, let's a couple of things that you've mentioned so far. You are one of the relatively few people, planners, that have worked both in the public sector and the private development side.
Correct.
You want to talk about the relative merits of each? Is it good to have experience in both?
Absolutely. In fact, I would urge any young planner that's coming up through the system to get some private experience somewhere doing something, so that you've actually sat on the other side of the table and get a feel for what the arguments are coming forward. It was invaluable for me. And I think there are a couple of reasons to do that. Number one is you get the experience. One of the benefits are pretty good too. I remember when I worked for Jim, he allowed me to bring my secretary, my personal secretary that I had in Dallas, to my office. I had a chance to redo my office, told me to go out and buy any car I wanted. It was great. But the second reason, I think, and getting that experience is good, whether you get all the bennies or not. I had a lot of them. But the other part of this is the fact that I have a lot of planners say to me, what was it like in the private sector? How was it? And I have to tell them, you need to get out there and actually do it. Don't be frustrated with your public job. Get out there and get on the other side. You can see if it's good or if it's bad. I said, I can tell you I had a great time. I made a lot of money. We did some interesting projects. But when the market went south, man, I started sweating because my job was on the line and I needed to do something else. So I say, absolutely, you've got to have, you don't have to. I urge people to try to get on that other side.
You've talked a little bit about some of the mentors that you've had through your career. Do you want to talk about some that maybe you've skipped over, or?
I know Robin talked a lot about Wei Ming, but Robin was much closer to Wei Ming. Wei Ming and I were both assistant directors at the time, so our relationship was more one of administration of the planning department. Marvin Springer, who was he was sort of the guru in North Central Texas as far as planners go, was a guy that I knew not really well. In fact, probably the most conversation I had with him was when we had those oral interviews and they were firing those questions at me, one right after the other. He was a mentor to a guy named Duncan. And Duncan, I think, actually hired Dan Sefco to work with him.
Duncan.
JT, right, and who has passed. JT and I were real close. I'm not going to say he was a mentor. We were more kind of on the same level because we've had the back experience and all that other stuff. I think he was a landscape architect, though, actually. Trying to think who else. One of the enjoyable parts of my job when I was with Dallas was not so much the mentors, but the people you dealt with as you went through the development process. The Ray Nashers of the world, who I used to lock horns with a lot. Trammell Crow, who was a wonderful gentleman. John Stemmons Freeway. I mean, being in a big city like Dallas at that time, I guess it was the 7th largest city, you really had an opportunity to meet with those people. Sometimes it wasn't pleasant because they had to come to you because you're a governmental agency and they had to meet the rules and regulations. But just seeing the way they operated, the way they thought, the way they challenged you with what you were saying was something that was really invaluable. And although they were not mentors, they were people that I got an awful lot of experience from.
Of course, the other side of that question is there's been a lot of people who have worked for you. Do you have any proteges that particularly stand out?
Well, most of them are dead now, David. The people that yeah, there are a couple. There's a guy named Pete Cavanaugh who is a private planning consultant who is actually one of my zoning planners in Dallas. Great guy. In fact, I just saw him a couple weeks ago. Came out here for a cell tower facility because apparently he's an expert in that field. John Kimbrough, who was my zoning administrator, he went to work for Master Plan. I don't know if John's still there or not. Marcy Diamond, who's my assistant director, was one of my zoning planners in Dallas. And then there was a guy named Paul Nelson who I think stayed in the planning department. He's since retired. But a lot of the people, the Charlie Pettigrews of the world, the Mike Finleys, they've passed. So, that's history.
Do you have any particular advice for a planner that might be in school or just out of school?
Yeah, I think I've already mentioned probably the major thing, and that is you need to try to get some developer experience, some non-governmental experience, just so have you can maybe you can communicate a little bit better. You kind of have to look at their point of view and try to come up with some sort of compromise if in fact there's an issue that can't be resolved unless there is compromise. And we have to compromise sometimes too. It's not just about the zoning ordinance or the subdivision regulations or the comprehensive master plan. Last night our planning commission meeting lasted till 10:30, and it involved mixed-use development, which is a dirty word in the suburbs. Mixed use has been something we've talked about for over 30 years in Coppell. But what people think of mixed use is apartments, overcrowded schools, congestion in the streets, crime everywhere. And it's really difficult to, especially in a small town like this with a lot of very educated people, where the demographics are changing, it's becoming more and more diverse, and explain to people that if you're going to have the vision, you need to provide tools that provide the vision, even though you may not be having that particular project on the books right now. And that's really, really difficult to do. So I guess the only other advice I'd have to the young planners, have an open mind and promote the vision.
We talked a little bit about planning organizations. Are you involved in any other organizations?
Well, yeah.
Professional, civic, social?
Sort of recreational. I am being from Michigan, I'm an automobile addict. I've had a 57 Thunderbird, XKE, a lot of Cadillacs. Thank you, private sector, for the Cadillacs. Right now, actually I've had Porsches for like 30 years. I'm probably the only planner in the nation that has 2 Porsches and a AMG Mercedes 500 SL, but I just love cars. In fact, I've got 7 of them. And it's kind of ironic, isn't it? I'm a planner, and we think cars are the evil empire, and yet here I have with all these vehicles. So yeah, I'm very active in the 356 registry, which is the old Porsches they look like upside down bathtubs. I have a show car there, then I have an 83 Porsche that I deal with. Right now, I'm one of the oldest planners. I think you said number 1 or number 2. I'm considering retirement. And what are you going to do in retirement? They say, don't retire, you go crazy. Well, I've got a lot of projects. I've got my cars. I'm a movie freak. I also have some property back in Michigan, on Lake Michigan. And my plan or my dream or my aspiration is to build a home on my lot on Lake Michigan, live there in the summer, live here in beautiful downtown Coppell in the winter, and go off into the sunset with a smile on my face.
You've mentioned your wife a couple times. You want to talk about your family?
Yeah, I have 3 sons. One, my oldest son, I have 1 grandchild from my oldest son. He's in the computer technology business somewhere. I don't know. You know, I'm the old school guy. Then I have 2 sons. They both went to Oklahoma State University. One is in the sports management field, and the other works for McKesson, which is a pharmaceutical company. My oldest son is like 41. My youngest son is 23. My wife sort of has a part-time job, but as I said, she's primarily, like my mother, a stay-at-home mom. I have 1 son that still lives with us, and once he moves out, there will probably be a challenging time for my wife to adapt to that.
Well, we've covered a lot of territory. Is there anything that you wanted to talk about that we didn't talk about?
I think not. I thought your question about how would you counsel a young planner coming up. One of the things we do in the city of Coppell is we try to understand the younger generation, the millennials, and the way they do a job and what they're looking for and how can we keep them, because they change jobs more than anybody in the world. Being old school, I'm the kind of guy that comes into work at 6:30 in the morning, doesn't take lunch. I do leave at 4. The millennials aren't that way, and we're always taking classes on trying to understand what the young planner is all about and deal with them more with regard to their philosophy of life than what ours was in the past. And so all I can say to the young planner is, look, you're going to get into jobs sometime, and it may be tough for you because of who your supervisor is, but you need to kind of understand where the old timers, the guys that have the gray hair, are coming from, and try to help them deal with you.
Well, with that, I want to thank you for your time, and
You bet.
we really appreciate it.
Thanks so much. You too, Brian.